Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Welcome back to Cineversary, a podcast that celebrates a milestone anniversary of a masterful work of cinema. Every month we send happy birthday wishes to a different film currently observing a joyous jubilee. Now we define that as anything from a 20th all the way up to a 100th anniversary. I'm your host, Eric Martin, creator of the Cineverse blog and moderator of the weekly Cineverse film discussion group. So, 40 years ago this week, a movie hit the theaters that redefined the action-adventure genre, turned its lead actor into a superstar, confirmed the indisputable talents of the two creative powers behind it, and went on to become the box office champ of that year. Of course, we're talking about Raiders of the Lost Ark, which made its debut on June 12th, 1981. And to help us celebrate the 40th birthday of this beloved film, I've recruited an archaeologist of the cinematic kind, you could say. It's James Kendrick, professor of film at Baylor University, movie critic for QNetwork.com, and author of several books, including Darkness in the Bliss Out, a reconsideration of the films of Steven Spielberg, and Hollywood Bloodshed, Violence in 1980s American Cinema. James also teaches courses on the works of Spielberg, so really he's the quintessential guest for this installment of Cineversary, and we are thrilled to have him aboard. Now, before I introduce Mr. Kendrick, we need to unseal the not-so-secret documents on Raiders and fill you in on the backstory of this motion picture with a little help from the Wikipedia machine. Oh, and by the way, being the film purist I am, I'm not going to refer to this month's film as Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, as it's been rechristened on home video and streaming. This movie was, is, and always will be simply Raiders of the Lost Ark, at least to me. Okay, here's what we know. Raiders of the Lost Ark is a 1981 American action-adventure film directed by Steven Spielberg and written by Lawrence Kasdan, based on a story by George Lucas and Philip Kaufman. It stars Harrison Ford, Karen Allen, Paul Freeman, Ronald Lacey, John Rhys-Davies, and Denholm Elliott. Ford portrays Indiana Jones, a globe-trotting archaeologist competing with Nazi German forces in 1936 to recover the long-lost Ark of the Covenant, a relic said to make an army invincible. Teaming up with his tough former lover Marion Ravenwood, played by Allen, Jones races to stop rival archaeologist Rene Belloc, portrayed by Freeman, from guiding the Nazis to the Ark and its power. Lucas actually conceived Raiders of the Lost Ark in the early 1970s. Seeking to modernize the serial films of the early 20th century, Lucas developed the idea further with Kaufman, who suggested the Ark as the film's goal. Lucas eventually focused on developing his 1977 space opera, Star Wars. Development on Raiders of the Lost Ark resumed that year when he shared the idea with Spielberg, who joined the project several months later. While the pair had ideas for set pieces and stunts for the film, they hired Kasdan to fill in the narrative gaps between them. Principal photography began in June 1980 on a $20 million budget and concluded the following September. Filming took place on sets at Elstree Studios, England, and on location mainly in France, Tunisia, and Hawaii. Although pre-release polling showed little audience interest in the film, especially compared to the superhero flick Superman 2, Raiders of the Lost Ark went on to become the highest-grossing film of 1981, earning approximately $330 million worldwide. Now, adjusted for inflation, that number actually exceeds $810 million, and that places Raiders as the 22nd highest inflation-adjusted grossing film in history. Raiders also played in some theaters for over a year. It was a critical success, receiving praise for its modern take on the serial film, its nonstop action and adventure, and the cast, particularly Ford, Allen, and Freeman. The film was nominated for several awards and, among others, won 5 Oscars. Now that includes Best Art Direction, Best Film Editing, Best Sound Editing, and Best Visual Effects. In the years since its release, Raiders of the Lost Ark has grown in esteem and is now considered one of the finest films of all time. It ranked number 60 and number 66 on the American Film Institute's Best American Movies lists of 1998 and 2007, respectively. And it also ranks as one of the greatest action-adventure films ever made, too. It had a lasting impact on pop culture, spawning a host of imitators across several media, and inspired many other filmmakers. The United States Library of Congress selected it for preservation in the National Film Registry in 1999. Raiders of the Lost Ark is the first entry in what would become the Indiana Jones franchise, which includes 3 more films so far at least: Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom from 1984, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, 1989, and Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, which was released in 2008. It also spawned a television series, video games, comic books, novels, theme park attractions, toys, and an amateur remake. There's even a 5th film scheduled for release sometime in 2022. Raiders merits a 95% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes currently, tallying an impressive 9.3 out of 10 average critical score. Eager for some excitement? Then let's give a listen to the original theatrical trailer for Raiders of the Lost Ark.
For nearly 3,000 years, man has searched for the lost Ark of the Covenant.
The Bible speaks of the Ark leveling mountains and laying waste to entire regions. Not something to be taken lightly. No one knows its secrets.
Jones, do you realize what the Ark is? It's a transmitter. It's a radio for speaking to God.
An army which carries the Ark before it is invincible.
The Ark, if it is their Eternis, then it is something that man was not meant to disturb.
It is protected by forces beyond imagination. It is desired above all treasures on earth by those who are good,
Trust me.
and those who are evil.
I'll tell you everything.
Yes, I know you will.
Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Let her go.
We have no time. If you still want the Ark, it has been loaded onto a truck for Cairo.
Raiders of the Lost Ark. A film from Steven Spielberg and George Lucas.
That brings back some good memories. Before rolling out the red carpet for my guest, a quick heads up. James and I are going to be exploring deep and dark caverns, pits, tombs, and catacombs of conversation in our analysis of Raiders, so be forewarned that, while booby traps are not exactly forthcoming, spoilers are. So now's your chance to become, I guess we'd call it, indie-fied, and find out what all the fuss was about. Why don't you finally go view Raiders of the Lost Ark if you've not done so already, and we'll wait here for you at the mouth of this cave teeming with hungry vampire bats as you go get cultured up. All set? I want to introduce James Kendrick, professor of film at Baylor University, movie critic for QNetwork.com, and author of several books on filmmakers and the cinema. James, welcome to Cineversary.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, such a treat and a great pleasure to talk with someone who's an expert on this particular film and the works of Steven Spielberg. So have to ask you just right out of the gate, when and where did you first see Raiders of the Lost Ark, and why and how is this movie important to you?
Well, I was a child of the 80s. It's not surprising that I would gravitate toward writing about and studying Spielberg at this stage in my life because I grew up with his films, and I guess I was in first grade when Raiders of the Lost Ark came out, And I actually wasn't allowed to see it. My parents thought I was too young. They'd heard some, scary things about melting faces and exploding heads and, things of that nature. So
Sure.
I'm pretty sure that I saw it originally on cable, probably a couple of years later.
Mm-hmm.
Although interestingly, I saw Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom first.
Wow.
Because
Okay.
that came out 3 years later. I was in fourth grade, and
Well, that kind of works, right? Because isn't that a prequel?
well, it is. It is.
Yeah.
The way it's set up. Of course, I didn't really recognize that at the time.
Sure.
But I did end up seeing that, and then I saw Raiders either on cable or VHS shortly thereafter.
So did it quickly become a favorite?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was enraptured with it. It's such an immediately engaging adventure, right from the beginning. It's got mystery and it's got action. It has that, incredible score. And it's in a lot of ways like a comic book, come to life, especially when you're a kid and you're watching it on that kind of a level, which I really think is what Spielberg was largely aiming at least on the surface, that experience from his own childhood watching serials.
You're a fan, of course, of Spielberg and his films. Where does this rank in his filmography for you?
To me, it ranks very high as far as just sort of pure cinema. With Spielberg, it's always kind of tricky because he has his popcorn movies and he has his serious movies.
Mm-hmm.
He has his historical dramas and so on. And there's always kind of a tendency to lean heavier toward those because they're the Schindler's Lists and the Saving Private Ryan, but as far as just sort of pure cinema and the use of all of the techniques of editing and cinematography and motion and music, I mean, to me it's very, very high up there.
Yeah, no, it's hard to kind of put these in a numbered order. Of course, for me, it's right up there as well. It's probably number 2 or 3. But just as my personal recollection, I have so many fond memories of this. I'm going to briefly share with you. I was a little bit older than you, so I think I would have been in 5th grade. Does that sound right? I think so. Or maybe going into 6th. So it was the spring of 81. I recall seeing the first movie posters and previews for Raiders. I remember those were kind of being disseminated out in newspapers and maybe a little bit on TV perhaps. But I was intrigued because I was, of course, a huge Harrison Ford fan, as Star Wars was, of course, my favorite film at that time. I mean, every boy in my neighborhood wanted to be Han Solo, right? So I don't remember if it was the film's opening weekend. Might have been the weekend after, like the Friday immediately after. But I planned a trip to the movie theater by myself. Now, I grew up in a neighborhood in Chicago called Rogers Park, and I took my bike up Devon Avenue to the Plaza Theater. I remember it was a 3-screen theater, one of the first multiplex kind of theaters, if you will, in my neck of the woods. And I wanted to see the afternoon showing. I remember it was a Friday. Out of school, of course, because this is mid-June. I was so blown away, Jim, by that first watch that I called my mom on the payphone in the lobby and I said, I'm staying for a second showing. Now, I don't know about today, but back then it was pretty easy to sneak back into a movie theater, so it was, wasn't that hard for a 12-year-old. But anyway, Raiders, I quickly discovered, was even better the second time around, back to back. So I phoned my mother again after viewing 2 and said I wouldn't be home for dinner. Now, my parents were pretty permissive. And I told her I loved this movie so much that I was going for a 3-peat. So I basically subsisted, Jim, on a single bucket of popcorn and some flat soda for over like 7 hours as I watched Raiders of the Lost Ark back to back to back. But I had the time of my life watching what I still regard 40 years later as the greatest action movie ever created. So that's where I stand on it. I'm a true believer, absolutely.
Yes, I can imagine you walking out of that multiplex dazed and exhilarated after a 3-peat of Raiders.
I just wanted to get on the roller coaster again. I wanted to tell all my friends, and I think I was the first among my group of friends that saw it. So absolutely, I was proselytizing and preaching its merits. I think we all went back probably the next weekend, to see it again. So, yeah, I have to ask you, you instruct a college course on the works of Spielberg, as we talked about. So how do you teach a film like Raiders of the Lost Ark to your students? What do you cover in a class like that?
I teach the class historically. So we move chronologically through his career and sort of look at the way his body of work develops and kind of how different themes emerge in different films and kind of recurring motifs and cinematic strategies and whatnot. So we analyze it stylistically, because it's such a kind of a great example of just pure visceral cinema.
Hmm.
And so, there's a lot that we can do aesthetically, looking at the way he puts sequences together, the way he cuts together images, the kinds of camera angles he uses, his use of light and shadow. It's an incredibly rich film that way. And then we also, we talk about how it fits into some of the bigger themes in his films, particularly, elements of conspiracy and distrust of the government, which was big in his early 70s films.
Yeah.
And Raiders is kind of a continuation of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he would continue that kind of motif or theme in the next year with E.T., of course. So, yeah, I see what you're talking about there. That could be a lot of fun to talk about with college students. Do you teach to a packed house? Do a lot of people still sign up for a course on Spielberg these days?
Yeah, I try to keep it fairly limited to about 25 students, because I like it to be more of kind of a discussion course, not like a big lecture course where people get lost, because I really want to hear from the students. And it's fascinating getting their responses, because, for students in 2021, 1981, that's 40 years ago.
Right.
That's ancient. That's old. And some of them have never seen it before.
Amazing.
Yeah.
That's just incredible to me. Like this, to me, this is one of those movies that I believe everybody has to see. And it's so funny because I now I have a 15-year-old, I have a 23-year-old. Of course, I brought them up properly and showed them Raiders and a lot of the Spielberg classics and so forth.
Good.
But got to be honest with you, especially with my youngest, it's like his generation, it's harder to impress. Like it's easier to kind of get bored and get distracted. There's so much fast, rapid cutting and editing these days, and much more, pyrotechnics and explosions and daring do and things like that. So that flabbergasted me, because I remember just seeing Raiders the first, second, third time, and just the pace of it. It was just breathtaking. And I thought, wow, I've never seen anything like, so rat-a-tat-a-tat-a-tat action. And of course, they've created even more action-packed films since then, but I think this set the template. So that's a nice segue perhaps to the next question I want to ask you, which is, why is Raiders worth celebrating 40 years later? Jim, why does it still matter, and how has it stood the test of time? What's your opinion here?
Well, to quote what you just said not too long ago, I mean, it really is one of, if not the greatest action adventure film ever made. And I think it's a film that all action filmmakers look to some degree. Have I done as well as Spielberg did in Raiders? Is my film as exciting? Is it as engaging? Is it as thrilling as Raiders? And so just as far as just the influence, that it's had in terms of shaping what the action film looks like, because it's such a unique film. It's such a unique merging of the old and the new. Because when Spielberg and Lucas were, kind of coming up with the concept of Indiana Jones in this film, they were reaching back into their own childhood. They were reaching back into those old movie serials that they had watched from the 30s and 40s and 50s,
Right, Flash Gordon.
Yeah, Flash Gordon, Commander Cody, Jungle Jim, all of those. And there's a real funny story that as they were working on the film, they got together and they went to a screening room and they played a bunch of those old serials. And they walked out and they were kind of disappointed. They were like, wow, we remember those being much better than they actually are. They're not nearly as exciting as we remember them being.
Right.
But the idea of them was still there. And so when they made Raiders, they wanted to basically take that concept, but kind of punch it up, with a more modern sensibility and a more modern pace. And what's really fascinating about the film is that 40 years later, even for viewers who were weaned on the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Harry Potter and all of these big super special effects films, they're still engaged by it. They still find it exciting. They still find it thrilling. So in a way, it hasn't aged the way the serials it was based on aged.
Yeah, it's a good point.
I look at it now and I'm like, it is just as exciting now as it was when I watched it when I was 10 years old.
Totally agree. I mean, I gave it another watch this past week, and I don't think it's really gathered a lot of cobwebs. It still feels fresh and relevant to me. But again, I'm a biased viewer here. But, if you were to show it to younger viewers today, it'd be an interesting perspective. And of course, you've already relayed your experience there. You teach it to, 18 to 21-year-olds. And some of them have never seen it before. But are they giving you their honest reactions? Does anybody say it's boring?
No, I get pretty honest reaction. My students do not shy away from me. Like, Dr. Kendrick, I know why. I understand you really like that movie, but no, I think they really do. And I think another thing is that a lot of them, they've only seen it on TV, like kind of, or on their computers, things like that. And when I screen them in my classes, we're doing it projected on a big screen.
That makes a big difference. Yeah.
And with an audience. There are a whole bunch of us in there watching it all together. So you get that kind of group experience where everybody's kind of jumping at the same time and grabbing their seats at the same time. And
so cool.
That makes a difference.
Absolutely. Yeah, my point on this question here in terms of why it still matters, how it stood the test of time, just kind of riffing on what you said, I think it's because it's so dang blasted fun.
Yeah.
That's because it was such an obvious work of joy and homage from two titans of the industry and creative wunderkinds, Lucas and Spielberg. They made Raiders to riff on cinema that they enjoyed growing up. You mentioned like the cliffhanger Saturday Adventures, like the Flash Gordons and the Captain Marvels and the Dick Tracy series, things like that.
Yeah.
You could also see influences that they had in terms of like Westerns, like Stagecoach.
Oh, yeah.
Zorro, Robin Hood, even Humphrey Bogart pictures. You think of like Casablanca and Treasure of the Sierra Madre and the Maltese Falcon. Indiana Jones possesses some of those same character elements that Bogart does. And then there's, adventure films that they would have probably seen on rerun TV or what have you, like Gunga Din, King Solomon's Mines from 1950. And of course, the James Bond movies, which were firmly in place since the early 60s. So their love and care for the material, I think, really shines through. We talked about this. But then I think it still matters, Jim, because it contains one of the very finest opening sequences in movie history. You think about those first 12 minutes as you follow Indy into and out of the Peruvian temple to retrieve that golden idol. We see Jones betrayed by his companions. We see him outmaneuver, one booby trap after another, narrowly avoid being trapped in by a closing wall. He's outrunning a gigantic boulder. He's being chased by armed natives. He barely escapes by plane. This movie within a movie, first 12 minutes, it serves as a masterclass to me in action-adventure filmmaking. It's like the perfect marriage of composition, of lighting, editing, special effects, sound effects, of course, stunt work, and that score by John Williams. I got to tell you, I bought that on vinyl in 1981. I was a movie geek, man. I got a lot of the classic Lucas Spielberg movie soundtracks, and I would just play the hell out of them. This was definitely one of my favorites. And I think that just to close the book on this question, I think it's also worth celebrating 40 years later because of, we mentioned the first 12 minutes, right? But you think of all the heart-stopping set pieces.
Oh, yeah.
Many of which continue to inspire awe and fond remembrances. After that unforgettable beginning scene, you get the fiery gunfight in the Nepalese bar. You get the Cairo market scene, including the skirmish with the knife-wielding assassins. Then comes this close shave with Belloc in the cafe. Then you get the thrilling map room sequence.
Yep.
After that, the show-stopping Well of Souls episode featuring thousands of terrifying snakes, the retrieval of the Ark, the daring escape, and then you go to the expertly choreographed fist fight around the spinning flying wing aircraft. Then you go to the showstopper of them all, the action-packed desert chase involving the truck.
Yeah.
Then it goes to Indy's nautical escape and his submarine stowaway scene. And then you got the final gripping act involving the opening of the Ark. I mean, there's no room to breathe. It's just nonstop. And technically, there are some lull moments in between, some romance angles and this and that. But really, it's just wall-to-wall action. It's amazing. And there are so many other memorable short bits that singularly stand out, Jim. Like, you think of the boulder rolling. Of course, people talk about that. That's like an internet meme in itself. You think of Indy's simple use of that handgun to dispatch the master swordsman. Great comic moment of relief. The basket search for a missing Marion. The poisoned dates. The reveal of the Staff of Ra imprint that's burned onto Tote's hand. Tote is the Nazi guy, the interrogator. And then Tote turning a supposed weapon of torture into a coat hanger, which is just brilliantly comedic. And then you think of like just a simple thing like Marion clocking Indy's chin with a swinging mirror. Like these little bits that are so memorable, I think they all collectively add up to, yeah, this movie is worth celebrating for all these reasons.
Oh, absolutely. Any movie would love to have just a handful of those great moments in it.
Right.
And it has all of it. I mean, it's interesting as you were kind of breaking it down and going like from sequence, you can really see how it could be easily broken up into a traditional serial. You can see the pieces, and how they all fit together. And like you said,
vignettes.
Yeah. And there's dialogue, there are character moments, but I think because the characters are so well thought out and so integrated into the action, they don't feel like lull moments.
Right.
You know, when you really think about it, there are actually quite a few, you know, kind of lengthy dialogue scenes throughout the film, but it all is moving forward.
I love those, Jim, don't you? Like, to me, they add so much color to the character and the intrigue.
Yeah.
Especially when he's talking to Brody. Yeah, just those exchanges to me are fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And they give all these little kind of hints of to me sort of a darker element to the film.
Yes.
So like, you know, the conversation with Brody after the whole opening sequence where it becomes clear that Indiana Jones he's a mercenary, basically.
Soldier of fortune, yeah.
He's sort of dispatched to go basically rob, you know, these sites for these precious things and then sell them to the museum, quote unquote, no questions asked. And those things just kind of flow through and they give kind of an extra dimension. And it's not really discussed. It's not like becomes a major component, but it's still there. And it still sort of creates a subtext that I think makes the rest of the film more interesting.
Yeah, I was reading a recent article. Of course, there's been a lot of published stories in the media celebrating the 40th anniversary of Raiders this past week and the past several weeks. One of them, I forget the publication online, but they basically interviewed archaeologists in terms of like how this movie inspired them or how it's not so accurate and things like that. That's kind of a fascinating take, right? And of course, as you can expect, this film gave rise to a lot of people pursuing archaeology as a profession. But you know, they're careful to point out that the real experts that this is not how, you know, archaeologists work.
It's not how it works.
And, you know, there's a lot of ethical dilemmas and questions going on here in terms of Indiana Jones' motivations, as you talked about being kind of a mercenary. So, of course, as with any film, you know, you can't take it as gospel truth. But it is interesting just to think in terms of how it would have influenced people just to study archaeology or get interested in it.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I can imagine a whole generation of kids, you know, being like, wow, I'm going to go study archaeology. This is the most amazing job ever.
So I want to ask you next, Jim, in what ways do you think that Raiders was influential on cinema and popular culture or set trends in any way? What can you identify here?
Well, I mean, obviously, along with Star Wars, it created a whole sort of generation of films that were kind of reaching back into the cinematic past. You know, as a period of, you know, I hate to use the term recycling because that seems kind of pejorative, but this idea of sort of pulling out elements of classical cinema and you know, older forms and renewing them and making them new again. And I think you really see that in a lot of films in the 80s in different kinds of ways. I mean, you see things like, I mean, even a movie like Top Gun, you know, being a kind of a military adventure throwback to what would have been like World War II sort of films. And, you know, drawing, you know, even the Westerns started coming back some at that time. And you have a film like The Natural, you know, that's pulling on these sort of mythic ideas from the cinematic past. So I think that was a major part. And then, you know, anytime you have a movie that creates a character as indelible as Indiana Jones, you've really landed somewhere significant there to have created a character who is so instantly memorable, who is so commanding in so many ways, and is, you know, a very complex character that can support a whole series of movies. And it's not like anybody ever gets tired of watching Indiana Jones.
No,
it's not like, it's like, oh, well, I've seen enough Indiana Jones, I'm not really interested in what else he has to do. You know, it's like, you want to see what he's going to do next. How is he going to respond? You know, and I do think that it kind of elevated what was expected from action movies. And I think, you know, Star Wars and the James Bond series was doing this as well. But as far as sort of the influence on action and adventure movies, it really raised those expectations in terms of what could be done and what was expected, you know, in the genre.
Yeah, can't argue there. Great points. My take here is, you think about the continuous tempo of excitement, and it must have had a huge impact on movies thereafter, because it seems that so many films in the wake of Raiders, at least to me, they followed this template created of wall-to-wall action, of adventure, of thrills. Of course, the Bond films came first, it must be said. But Raiders increased our appetites for faster action, more daring and dangerous stunts, closer shaves, more memorable set pieces, more colorful villains. and a new infusion of fantasy and the supernatural sometimes mixed in with the science and the human exploits.
Yeah.
I think you can trace this kind of template, Jim, and this kind of lineage directly to later 1980s films. Now, you mentioned Top Gun, but follow me here in a somewhat chronological order. I'm not saying definitively these are among the descendants of Raiders, but yeah, I think you could trace a lineage. Like you think of The Road Warrior the next year, then First Blood. Then you got Aliens a few years later. You got Big Trouble in Little China, Predator, Die Hard, The Abyss. And then you think of like Tim Burton's Batman even, just in terms of the action kind of template setup. Now, of course, there's more obvious imitators, like Romancing the Stone and The Jewel of the Nile, the sequel, right? The Goonies is an obvious descendant. The 1985 remake of King Solomon's Mines. And then as you head into the 90s, you think of The X-Files and how that would have been influenced or inspired by Raiders to some extent. The Mummy remake from 1999 and the Mummy sequels.
Oh, absolutely.
National Treasure with Nicolas Cage and its sequel. You got Lara Croft, Tomb Raider, and its sequel. Sky Captain in the World of Tomorrow. The Librarian trilogy of TV movies. No, I didn't even know these existed. You have a film like Sahara and Hidalgo. I don't know if you saw these. But
yes, with Viggo Mortensen.
Yeah, I definitely thought of Raiders of the Lost Ark and Indiana Jones. And then the first Captain America movie, Captain America the First Avenger. I mean, the filmmakers came right out and said they were pumped up as an homage in a way to Raiders of the Lost Ark and Indiana Jones. So that's a pretty strong lineage to me. Of course, Indiana Jones inspired plenty of imitations in other media, like, Robert Landon's Dan Brown adventure books. Video games like Pitfall and Uncharted and, of course, Tomb Raider.
Yeah.
There have been countless nods to Raiders, in particular in TV, pop culture. You think The Simpsons, of course, Family Guy, South Park, but also like Toy Story, Borat, Chicken Run, The Incredibles. I mean, it's the gift that keeps on giving in terms of pop culture nods.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's one of those films that you can immediately reference in just the vaguest way, and people immediately know what it is. It's like just one little nod towards like, oh yeah, that's a Raiders homage. I mean, that's a Raiders parody. I see what you're doing there. Absolutely. And I think it's, there are those movies that were very clearly trying to cash in directly, like you mentioned, the 85 remake of King Solomon's Mines and the attempt to, make Richard Chamberlain into another, with Alan Quartermain, which interestingly, obviously Alan Quartermain far predates Indiana Jones, was actually, one of the inspirations for him.
This is true. Sure.
But just the genre as a whole, I mean, the action genre just really ratcheted up very quickly in the wake. And you can see Spielberg wanting to top himself in Temple of Doom, that the action sequences in that with like the runaway mine car and all of that, you can really see him realizing the effect that he had on the genre and that he needs to continue, raising the bar.
Good point. I just wish that sequel was a better movie.
Yeah, it has its fans, it has its detractors. I can see the arguments on both sides.
But I think he returned to form strongly in The Last Crusade, the third chapter.
Yeah. He always sort of talked about that in a way. Last Crusade was sort of an apology for Temple of Doom. There's more than the movie people were studying, but I can see why they wanted to go in a very different kind of direction. That they didn't want to just repeat themselves. I have to respect that.
And then the Crystal Skull, the fourth installment, middling to lesser degree.
Yeah, again, a movie that works on paper, but not necessarily in action.
Yeah, to me, it's a nostalgia trip, and that's about it. But I'm hopeful that it's going to follow the pattern of good movie, bad movie, good movie, bad movie. So the fifth one, which is scheduled for next year, even though it does feature a close to 80-year-old Harrison Ford.
It'll be interesting to see what they do with that, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm keeping my hopes up, but, I'm not holding my breath.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens. So, Jim, there are elements from this movie you could argue that have aged well, and then there are some that are maybe showing some wrinkles. What would you say here?
Well, I mean, the movie has always come under some criticism for its ethnic and racial caricatures. Whenever you have the crusading Anglo-American hero entering into, the quote unquote exotic Middle East or foreign lands, and, and all the residents there just sort of become background fodder for the action.
Yeah.
Some of that feels a little bit creaky and was probably problematic at the time as well. When I look at the effects, though, I started to think like, well, some of the special effects, but honestly, I think the effects in Raiders are much better than the digital effects in Crystal Skull. I think they hold up much better.
I think you're right.
In their way.
Yeah.
there's some little things here and there, but I think the reason we're talking about this film 40 years later the way we are, and we'll continue talking about it, is because it has aged so well that very little of it feels like it's not working as well as it did back in 1981.
Yep, we're in simpatico here, but I think the agency and the spunk that's given to a character like Marion, I think that's aged very well.
Mm-hmm.
You know, instead of being a helpless and impossibly beautiful damsel in distress, as you would expect maybe from a film of this era,
Mm-hmm.
Marion, to me, she remains an exceptionally strong female character at a time in American cinema when that was a rare occurrence in an action flick.
Right, especially like with the James Bond movies.
Yes, exactly. They're just sex objects, you know, who basically bed down with him. But, you know, she can drink men under the table. She can land a good right hook. She could blow smoke in a Nazi's face.
Yep.
She can wield a frying pan like a samurai sword. She can mow down lots of bad guys with bullets. So Marion is the bomb to me, and that's cool for a film 40 years old. But on the other hand, Jim, there's been a lot of media publicity. I've seen one article after another about how there's controversy with this movie now in terms of, was Indiana Jones a pedophile?
Oh, yes, yeah.
You think about how Marion was technically, I guess, underage when Jones was romantically involved with her, which would intimate that, you know, Jones was either a sexual predator or a pedophile. But I'll quote you something that Karen Allen said recently in an interview. She said that, I guess you could say there are sinister undertones. That's always what I imagined is she was 16, he was 26, and he was her father's student. And it's left very mysterious. I mean, they could have kissed a few times, and she was just completely bowled over, and he could have just not wanted to get involved with someone so young, and maybe my father would have been furious at him, so she obviously cared deeply for him. He may have cared for her too, but in the end decided it was a dangerous situation and didn't want to be involved. I mean, I guess when something is as vague as that, you can color it any way you want to color it. I've tended to color it sort of that it was quite innocent. When she says it was wrong and you knew it, I mean, I think maybe he led her on in some way. But when she says she was a child, I think she meant she was 16. I don't think of him as a pedophile, unquote. So at least that's what Karen Allen thinks about it. It's subject to interpretation. What's your thought here?
Yeah, it's definitely left vague, and I can see how those wanting to read some real problematic things into it, it's open for that, just because it is so vague. And we actually talk about this quite a bit in my class when we teach this film. And to me, it's always just been part of the larger texture of Indiana Jones's character, which is that, kind of like Han Solo, he's kind of a scoundrel. He's not a particularly great moral beacon. He's fighting the good fight, but he has a lot of flaws and he has a lot of complexities and some kind of dark subtext, and that this was kind of a shady thing from his past that he regrets, although he does not terribly apologetic for it. To call him a pedophile, I think is definitely reaching pretty deep. And I think Karen Allen's interpretation of it is most likely, I would imagine, what Lawrence Kasdan was thinking when he was writing the screenplay, and what Lucas and Spielberg were thinking, when they were making the film. Just that it creates a dramatic sensibility in their relationship, something for them to surmount.
How is Ford ideal for this role? What does he bring to the character? How does he compare to contemporary action stars of the 80s, like you think of Schwarzenegger, Stallone, Steven Seagal, Bruce Willis, or even the various actors who played James Bond?
I want to go back to something I said earlier, which is this idea that Raiders is sort of like a comic book brought to life, right? And I think one of the reasons it works as well as it does is because Harrison Ford is not a comic book character. He is a very down-to-earth, grounded sort of actor. And he brings a sense of humanity and reality to that character, that he's not invulnerable. He's not, to compare him to the other 80s action stars, it's of a completely different register. He's not these bulging biceps, incredible sort of muscle bound sort of figure that Stallone and Schwarzenegger were, that it was almost impossible to take them seriously as human beings. They were just sort of militaristic killing machines. He's sort of a normal average guy in extraordinary circumstances. Yeah. That's the kind of thing that drove Hitchcock films. And that's to a large extent what drives this. So I think that's one of the reasons the action scenes work as well, is because you're genuinely fearing for him. He gets beat up, he gets bruised and bloodied and torn up. And there's that whole scene on the ship where he's aching and hurting, and Marion's trying to care for him, and he's whining about everything, George Lucas originally envisioned him as this sort of fantasy James Bond character. And Harrison Ford, Spielberg, and Lawrence Kasdan were all like, no, we got to, Spielberg originally at one point wanted him to be an alcoholic. They wanted to bring him down to earth. And I think that's a large part of what Harrison Ford brings to that character. Then Harrison Ford is just so incredible in that role. He brings such an amazing combination of absolute confidence and bravado, but also a kind of a comical ineptitude at times too.
Yeah, totally agree. I think unlike Bond, who's played as unflappable, cool under fire, composed, he's suave, he's silently confident, I think Ford infuses Indy with a lived-in mortal quality. Mm-hmm. This is a man who expresses, as you said, fear, panic, disgust. He moans, he grunts, he winces in pain. He fights dirty when he's outmatched.
Oh yeah, he does. The wing sequence, yeah.
It's great. Kicks the guy right in the jewels and throws sand in his face. And come on, because otherwise he's not going to win that
he's
fight.
Outmatched, and he knows it.
Yeah, he knows. He realizes, he knows the odds. But he shows overall more plausible human-like qualities and ranges of emotion. He also sometimes has bad timing. He miscalculates due to overconfidence. Mm-hmm. You think of like the booby traps. He thinks he's outsmarted them, right? In the lair of the golden idol. Or when he's hanging by a rope on the edge of a pit and he believes he's close to pulling himself out, only to suddenly drop down further when the rope extends. It gives you a flavor of, he's sometimes a little cocky and overconfident. And I think additionally, Ford, and by extension Indiana Jones, is, as you said, this isn't a muscle-rippling physical powerhouse. It's not a towering figure. Instead of relying on brawn or, martial arts skills or high-tech weapons, he gets himself out of jams by what? By being resourceful, mm-hmm. by using his wits, by making quick decisions on his feet. And you think of like a character such as, John McClane, played by Bruce Willis in Die Hard. Ford exerts this scruffy, everyman masculinity that can be charmingly fallible.
Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's key to the film and the series as a whole. Mm-hmm. The scenarios are over the top, crazy, absurd, wonderfully so. But his presence and his reactions and his performance mm-hmm. ground those. They bring them just enough down to earth that we can really believe it. And that helps us really get into it and feel it and experience it.
It's just so incredible to think the casting search far and wide, they were throwing this net, try to land the perfect Indiana Jones and some of the big names that were ascribed to this role possibly. And all the time, Harrison Ford is right under their nose.
He was right
just
there.
Waiting to become a superstar. And boy, did he become a superstar by virtue of this movie in particular. And you think of the top grossing films of all time. He is the champ.
Yeah.
He is, the highest grossing actor in terms of appearing in the highest grossing film. So that's no small feat. I'm not saying he's Laurence Olivier. No one would accuse Ford of that. But boy, all the qualities we described here and all the things he brings to it, he's perfect for a role like Indiana Jones.
Yeah, he really is. They could not have cast better.
Absolutely not. Do you identify any messages, themes, or morals in Raiders of the Lost Ark? I know this is a popcorn movie, Jim. I know we shouldn't overanalyze or overthink what should be a fun adventure film, and I'm not trying to do that. But every month in my visit with my guest, I do ask this question. I think there's at least one or two here that we can briefly explore.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that the whole element of government conspiracy and power, entrenched power, mm-hmm. I think is a very important part because, at the end of the day, Raiders of the Lost Ark is really about two competing governments trying to get hold of this supernatural object for their own purposes. And, it's easy because the adversaries are Nazis. And so, nobody's going to root for them. So anything mm-hmm. they do is going to be wrong. And if you're fighting against the Nazis, you're doing something right. But I think it's worth noting that, and I've read some things about, Raiders of the Lost Ark is such a feel good, it's a patriotic film, it's, American exceptionalism. And I just don't really see it that way. When you look at the government agents who come to see him, first of all, they're cast to look like Laurel and Hardy.
Interesting. Yes, you're right.
When you look at them, they are Laurel and Hardy, but they're nefarious Laurel and Hardy. And, when you get to the mm-hmm. end of the film, one of the things I find so fascinating, particularly about Raiders, is that as much as it is rousing and exciting and all of this, Indiana Jones loses. and he keeps losing. He regularly loses. He loses over and over again to Belloc.
That's right.
And literally, he comes out unscathed at the end because he defers to the wrath of God, and literally allows that to take over. He never defeats Belloc. He never defeats the Nazis.
Nope.
Literally, God does. And then at the end of the movie, the nefarious American agents take the Ark away from him with these empty assurances of, top men are studying it. Meanwhile, they're boarding it up and putting it in a warehouse because they're terrified of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely want to talk to you about that final scene if we have time, because it's an interesting, different set of interpretations there that could be explored. I just want to go back to what you said a moment ago, which I completely agree about. To me, the major theme is the character arc of Indiana Jones himself, who, at least in this story, would seem to turn from a strictly secular soldier of fortune who only looks out for himself to a true believer in a higher power and a better partner and protector of Marion, too.
Mm-hmm.
So by the conclusion of this story, Indy comes full circle around to a renewed respect for antiquity, perhaps, a reverence for relics that carry spiritual significance, although it's kind of interesting that that through line is not carried through in the sequels, but let's just pretend this is a standalone film for now. And you also see that he becomes a more reliable love interest for Marion, okay? I mean, that's subject to interpretation, but that's how I see it.
Mm-hmm.
So you think about how it's suggested earlier in the movie that Indy is on a negative trajectory. You recall Belloc's words to him. He says, "You and I are very much alike. Archaeology is our religion, yet we have both fallen from the pure faith. Our methods have not differed as much as you pretend. I am but a shadowy reflection of you. It would only take a nudge to make you like me, to push you out of the light." And you recall as well, Jim, how he apparently took advantage of a young and impressionable Marion years earlier and then discarded her, much like the objects he hunts for and then forgets about once he's collected them so that he can turn his attention to a new prize. Now, this is one reading of the film, which I tend to agree with. But it takes this new adventure with an older, more mature Marion for Indy to realize that he truly cares for her, that she forgives him to some extent, and that he needs to work harder to keep her safe. Now, these things aren't talked about. It's suggested.
Right.
And to me, it works. This makes sense. So by the end of the story, if you follow this theme here of the character arc of Jones, Indy recognizes his hubris of outright dismissing the mythology and the sacrosanct nature of a revered religious artifact like the Ark of the Covenant. And this is why he warns Marion not to look at the Ark when it's open. I remember, 12 years old, I'm like, why? I don't
you
get
want
it.
to see it?
How is that protecting him? It makes more sense the more you see it, because he has reverence.
Mm-hmm.
He has respect for the religious and mythical significance. And it's also why, after he's told that top men are working on the Ark, Indy calls them fools, bureaucratic fools. They don't know what they've got there. So to me, anyway, there's two possible interpretations here. Indy assumes that the U.S. government is either going to probe and study the Ark like a rare dinosaur fossil, which I guess would be disrespectful, could be dangerous, or they're going to hide the Ark, as you said, among the government's many other buried secrets, which is what we see happen.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's a fate that appears to irritate the inquisitive Jones and his colleague Brody. But the latter interpretation, Jim, is more plausible. You remember that Brody tells the government agents the Ark is a source of unspeakable power and it has to be researched.
Right.
He and Jones apparently don't want the Ark to be disappeared and forgotten, but maybe carefully and respectfully investigated. So, yeah, what's your take here? How do you balance those two interpretations?
Yeah, I mean, to me, everything in the film is geared toward that second interpretation. I mean, it's even, it's in the dialogue when Brody comes over to Indy's house to tell him that that he's got to go. And Brody is very concerned. He's like, it's like nothing you've ever gone after before. And India mocks him. It's like, you sound like my mother. You think I'm, worried about you. You think he says superstitious hocus pocus. Well, yeah, he learns that the superstitious hocus pocus is for real by the end of the film. And so I think, that you have the arc of Indiana Jones realizing where he has underappreciated the supernatural and other dimensions of existence, but the U.S. government is still kind of on its through line, and it's going to do what it's going to do, regardless of what someone like he's, and that he's ultimately just kind of used and discarded by the government. And that very much frustrates him. And he realized that one of the final lines of dialogue is fools, bureaucratic fools.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's that second reading that holds more water. But real quickly, I just want to talk about that final shot of the film. It's famous, right?
Yes.
Spielberg has stated that the scene of the vast warehouse containing countless crates of classified secrets is kind of an homage to the final sequence of Citizen Kane, in which we see an endless array of gather valuables, antiquities, with some destined to be forgotten and destroyed, like the Rosebud
Right.
sled. Sorry, spoilers there,
Whoops.
but if you haven't seen Citizen Kane, shame on you. But anyway, it has been suggested, Jim, that this warehouse is the infamous Hangar 51. Now, that was a U.S. military installation in Nevada where the government supposedly kept secrets from the public, like, the remains of the Roswell incident. And this reading hints that the government is going to treat the Ark not like the awesomely powerful mystical vessel it is, but yet another, kind of too dangerous for the public to know about artifact that needs to be kept top secret and hidden. And that implies that the government is engaged in a cover-up, which plays into the public's pervasive conspiracy theories, as we were talking about.
Yes.
Think about just as the Ark was concealed by God or nature thousands of years ago, the Ark is given a new hiding spot to prevent bad actors from infiltrating it. But this also insinuates, Jim, that the Ark is a Pandora's box waiting to be discovered and opened again, possibly unleashing terrible supernatural power, or as we called it, the wrath of God. You remember that the warehouse sequence in the fourth installment, Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, it did confirm that the U.S. government had been concealing other relics of great power and or significance. Not that you have to, turn to a later chapter for confirmation, but it is kind of a validation there. So the ultimate question is this ending a warning against too much bureaucracy? Subscribers to this theory can assume that the Ark is lost forever in a bureaucratic well of souls. It's simply been moved, from a snake pit in Egypt to a red tape pit in Nevada. So is this a warning against too much red tape or bureaucracy?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does play into those kinds of ideas, and I think that thread again is sort of all the way through the film. That there are no really good representations of government agency throughout the film. The U.S. government is not portrayed as evil, but it's portrayed as conspiring and dishonest, and basically willing to do whatever they feel like they need to do to achieve their ends. And so I do think, when Spielberg talks about that final shot in relation to Citizen Kane, and of course, the final shot in Citizen Kane of all of those, the accumulation of his life. And the key in that film is that it's ultimately meaningless. That doesn't tell us anything about Charles Foster Kane, just like the sled doesn't. It's a mystery without an answer. It's a search without something at the end of the rainbow. And I think that's kind of what was probably in Spielberg's head is, so we have, this huge government warehouse filled with all of this stuff that's just going to be hidden away and sort of come to nothing. Because we can't do anything with it. We're not gonna. And it's amazing because there were some, critics back in the 80s who viewed the film as very conservative, very regressive. And they thought that the US government having the Ark at the end was sort of validation of America as the great exceptionalist country that, God basically entrusted the Ark to America. And that always seems to me to be a very strained reading, and that the tone doesn't fit that.
Here's the thing: we don't see the government use the Ark. I realize this is 1936. We haven't entered into World War II yet, but there's the suggestion perhaps that they're going to keep it bottled up or boxed up.
Right.
So they're not going to use it at the forefront of their armies per se. So maybe that indicates a level of respect.
Yeah, or something, or just fear. Again, it does kind of fit that conspiratorial mindset of, well, things are being hidden away. But to me, there's so much effort of showing it being boxed up and stenciled and stamped, and then this sort of just very non-threatening elderly worker pushing it on a cart and then just pushing it under all of these other boxes that that it's clearly kind of meant to be forgotten.
Yeah, no, good point. Jim, this is a birthday party in a way, 40th anniversary of Raiders of the Lost Ark. I always contend that it's the fans who continue to get the gifts, however. So what is this film's greatest gift to viewers?
It's just the thrill of it, that it's such an exciting film. It's such a engaging film. It's one of those ones that it just rushes by. It's like it's 2 full hours and you don't even notice them. They just go. So I think just that wonderful, visceral, exciting experience. And when you walk out, you've really just seen something.
Yeah, can't improve on that. But I will say, for my take, I think there are 2 greatest gifts that bear repeating. First is the quality and quantity of fantastic set pieces found throughout the movie. As mentioned, you get one of the absolute best openers in movie history. You get the Well of Souls. There's the desert chase truck escapade, which honestly I believe constitutes the finest filmmaking in this picture. and then the opening of the Ark. And those 4 sequences alone would be enough to satisfy an action-adventure fan. But then the hits keep on coming in Raiders. You also get, as we said, the bar fight, the map room scene, the fist fight, the Cairo market chase, a lot of other pulse-quickening scenes. So Raiders is packed to the gills with thrills. I think we can agree. The second greatest gift for me, and this cannot be understated, the film score for Raiders. I think it represents one of the finest achievements by movie maestro John Williams, and he has so many of them. I remember getting that soundtrack on vinyl and just playing the hell out of it. And you think of the main title, it still generates goosebumps to me. The idle temple music, it builds intrigue and fascination. The map room composition, that remains stirring. And then the Desert Chase March, it just stands out as probably one of the top 5 songs that Williams has ever composed. So at least 2 greatest gifts from me. Jim, is there anything you're currently working on that listeners should check out?
I've got a couple things I'm working on. I'm actually working on a couple of Spielberg-related book chapters, one on Jurassic Park, another on the relationship between Spielberg and Lucas, interestingly. And recently I've been starting to do some research on Cornell Wilde.
Wow.
Yeah. I'm kind of digging deep into some forgotten figures, and I found my way to him through some other research, and I've really discovered him as a really fascinating early actor turned independent producer director at a time when actors were not really doing that. And I've found that he's a really fascinating figure that not much has been written about, especially lately. And I'd kind of like to bring him back into the discussion of important classical Hollywood figures.
No, that sounds fascinating. Now, are the chapters meant to update for a new updated edition of a previous book?
No, they're coming out in anthologies, edited anthologies that others are doing that they invited me to contribute a chapter. So
Gotcha. Okay.
It'll be some good work, I think.
Looking forward to learning more about that. How can people follow you on social media or otherwise?
Well, I'm on Facebook, and you can also always follow my reviews on qnetwork.com. I'm regularly reviewing both theatrical and streaming films, and also, stuff recently released to 4K and Blu-ray, including I'll be posting a review here pretty soon of the new 4K Indiana Jones box set. It'll probably be out in the next day or two.
Oh, terrific.
Yeah, I have that in the player, ready to spend some more of that tonight.
Nice.
Good timing.
Very, very good. Well, Jim, I want to thank you for taking the time to take a deep dive with us, go spelunking in the caves with Indiana Jones and retrospect on this movie. 40 years old already. Can't believe time's marching on here. I feel so much older, especially when you tell me you saw it in first grade. I think I was in 5th or 6th grade. So in any event, thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I really enjoyed talking to you about it.
All right, keep up the great work, Jim, and keep spreading the gospel of Spielberg.
I will. Good talking to you, Eric.
Yep, I've said it before, and it bears repeating. It's nice to know that you're not alone in this world in your impassioned fondness for a given film. Having a true believer guest like Jim Kendrick join you in your homage to a movie like Raiders, yeah, that's the fuel that propels this podcast, believe me. So gracias again, Jim, for joining us and for sharing your knowledge and memories of Raiders of the Lost Ark. Such a treat. Thank you. We move now to standing ovations. This is where I give a shout out to a book, film, podcast, TV program, website, or other work that I think would be of interest to listeners like you. In case you weren't aware, TCM has its own podcast. It's called The Plot Thickens, and it's hosted by Ben Mankiewicz. Season 1 wrapped last year, but Season 2 is going to commence June 29th, this month. This time around, Ben is going to focus on a highly anticipated flick that fizzled at the box office despite having a stellar cast and master director involved. It's a look back at The Bonfire of the Vanities, the 1990 film based on the best-selling novel by Tom Wolfe that flopped commercially and failed to ignite the favor of critics. Season 2 will examine what went horribly wrong with this picture, providing archival recordings on the set of the production and comments by director Brian De Palma, actors Tom Hanks and Melanie Griffith, and others. If Season 2 is anything close to the caliber of the debut season of The Plot Thickens, I think we're in for a real treat, so check that out. Turner Classic Movies has also announced that Season 3 of that podcast will drop this fall, and it's going to tell the story of the life and career of Lucille Ball, the famous redheaded comedian. So lots of great podcast content in the works by TCM this year. Also, a quick mention that I'm going to be appearing as a guest on someone else's show this month. It's the Monster Kid Radio podcast, and it's hosted by Derek Cook, who asked me to join him to discuss the German thriller M, starring Peter Lorre. Yes, it's the same movie that we featured just 2 months ago on this program in episode number 34. So if you like that episode, if you love that film, you might want to tune into the Monster Kid Radio installment that should drop before the end of June, which can be had pretty much anywhere you get your podcasts. Instead of cluttering up our podcast with advertisements, we've decided to ask our listeners for their support. We could use your help to offset the costs to produce Cineversary, which includes expenses like podcast hosting provider fees. If you'd like to make a monetary contribution to the Cineversary podcast in any amount, large or small, we've made it safe and simple by partnering with PayPal to collect the funds. Simply visit tinyurl.com, that's tinyurl.com/donate Cineversary, and click on the Donate button. Any major credit card is accepted, and the entire transaction is handled securely and confidentially by PayPal. Or if you're familiar with PayPal, you can simply send us a payment in any amount you want to cineversegroup@gmail.com, and that's spelled CINEVERSE group@gmail.com. We really appreciate your generosity. Also, I'd love to hear what you think of our Cineversary podcast. You can email me suggestions or comments at cineversegroup@gmail.com. And I encourage you to visit cineversegroup.com, the portal for my film discussion group that I launched in 2005, where you can hear podcast recordings of our group discussions and read more about the movies we study. All right, if you've made it this far, you undoubtedly want to know what's next up to bat. In July, Cineversary will pay tribute to a movie within a genre we've not yet explored on this show, the Western. Return with us next month as we celebrate the 65th anniversary of John Ford's revered classic, The Searchers, originally released in 1956. Until then, this has been your humble host, Eric Martin, reminding you to butter up that popcorn, live a big screen surround sound life, and cherish those classic movies because, as I say every month, they're not getting older, they're getting better. Thanks again for listening.